Hello everyone, my name is Johan Svanberg. I work at the Swedish Labour Movement's Archives and Library at the Research Department. And I bid you all welcome to this Nordic Labour History Network seminar. Today we will have a presentation by Johan Svanberg from Stockholm University, who is going to talk about German labour migrants and the Swedish textile industry, a book he has written. And before I give the floor to Johan, I just want to say that you can ask questions by using the chat or the raise hand function here in Zoom. But this is a webinar, so I will have to give you the microphone, so to speak, to allow you to talk. So I will collect all the questions for after the presentation. So we start with Johan. The floor is yours, Johan.
Thank you. The presentation I will give today is actually based on a book. This book, in English, it would be The Construct of Migration, which I published several years ago by now. It's published in 2016, and also published a few articles in English as from this project. And the title of the presentation today is actually the title of one of the English articles I published out of this book. I will share my screen. No, I hope everyone can see it. The title of my presentation today is Migration at the Multi-Level Intersection of Industrial Relations, the Schleswig-Holstein campaign and the Swedish garment industry in the early 1950s. So not actually the textile industry, as Jonas said about the garment industry. I usually make a point that it's actually two very different branches or sectors of the industry. When I talk about this project or about this book, I usually start by saying something about why I started to write it. When I wrote my dissertation in history, this is like 12 years ago by this point in time, I wrote my dissertation about Estonian World War II refugees who came to Sweden mainly in the fall of 1944. And I wrote about their encounters with Swedish car factory workers when they started to work in Swedish industry after the war. And while I was working with this dissertation, I visited the archive of the Swedish National Labour Market Board in Söderhamn, Arbetsmarknadsstyrelsen in Swedish, the very same authority that is now called Arbetsförmedlingen. And while I was working with my dissertation in this archive, I also found an archive box with the title The Schleswig-Holstein campaign, Schleswig-Holstein-aktionen in Swedish. Of course, as a curious researcher, I couldn't help myself from look into that box as well, although it had nothing to do with my dissertation. And when I got back to Växjö, I did my PhD program in Växjö at the Linnaeus University. I managed to do an interlibrary loan and get this box from the archive in Söderhamn to my university library in Växjö. Because by then I realized I'd have stumbled into a migration that I hadn't read anything about, I think, in the migration literature. This was rather late in my PhD program, so I at least thought I had a pretty good knowledge about the state of the art in Swedish literature about migration. And only by browsing the documents in this folder, I learned that about 800 young Germans had come to Sweden in 1950 and 1951 through what the Swedish National Labour Market Board in a rather bureaucratic language, a rather typical language of the 1950s, called the Schleswig-Holstein campaign. And a majority of these 800 youngsters, German youngsters, were women, and most of them got employed in Swedish garment or textile industries. But back then, this was in 2008 or 2009, I was in the archive in Söderhamn. I had a dissertation to finish, but already then I planned to make a research application about this when I was finished with my dissertation. And 8 or 7 years later, in 2016, I published this book I just showed you. The overall aim of the study is to analyze German migration to Sweden from a labor perspective. The book is mainly about the division of labor on the Swedish labor market and about how migrations have affected social relations at work and how migrations have affected the industrial relations concerned. My twofold aim is to analyze how the divisions on the labor market as regards gender, ethnicity, class, and age were created and continuously recreated by actors on different societal levels in connection with migration processes, and to study how such dividing processes affected the people concerned in everyday working life. At a structural level, much of my research is generally concerned with how different kinds of actors take part in the process of creating migrations. I study how different kinds of actors direct migrations to different parts of the labor market. Why are migrants from a certain nationality recruited to certain parts of the labor market and not the other parts? Why do we find mainly male migrants in certain sectors and at certain jobs, and female migrants in other sectors and at certain other assignments? Such actors who take part in the process of shaping the direction of migrations might be labor market authorities, both in sending and receiving country. It might be employers or employers associations, but it might also be trade unions. And of course, now I talk about actors besides the migrants themselves and their driving forces and choices, which of course are very important too. Besides such structural questions, I'm also very interested in the actual effects of migrations. What happens in the actual encounters on the shop floor between migrants and native-born workers? That is what I mean by the second part of my aim, to study how such dividing processes affected the people concerned in everyday working life. Societal levels is an important concept here as well. With this concept, I basically mean three sets of relationships. Firstly, international contacts between Swedish and German authorities, an international level that is. Secondly, relations in Sweden between labor market authorities, employee associations, and trade unions. And thirdly, local labor market relations in Sweden. So international, national, and local labor market relations. On local level, I focused on Borås in this book and the garment plant Algots. Besides Norrköping, Algots was certainly the #1 garment factory city in Sweden during the post-war decades. And Algots in turn was the largest clothing factory in Sweden in the 1950s, and probably also the most rationalized clothing factory in the country. The workers at Algots produced clothes along mechanized conveyor belts, and the division of labor was very, very far driven. In this presentation, however, I will mostly talk about the structural level, and accordingly about the first part of my aim here, how migrants were steered to different parts of the labor market according to gendered, ethnic, or age-related principles. I will show how some employers motivated the recruitments of certain kinds of workers, and I will discuss how a trade union could use the employer's great demand for workers to its own advantage. The initiative for the so-called Schleswig-Holstein campaign came from the West German labor market authorities in the autumn of 1949 by an inquiry to the Swedish authorities on the possibility to send a couple of hundred young Germans to Sweden for work, training, and some regular work. It was one of the regional social democratic ministers who were in Sweden, and he had a meeting with Gustav Möller, the Minister of Social Affairs, and made an inquiry about the possibilities to send a couple of hundred young Germans to Sweden. The explicit German purpose with this initiative was that the prospective migrant should return to West Germany after a certain time of education and work in Sweden, and thereby take part in the process of rebuilding a war-wrecked Germany with their newly usurped skills. From German point of view, the goal was thus a temporary migration to Sweden. A more implicit German purpose than offering the youngsters work training and work abroad was to, so to speak, export a bit of its unemployment problem. Bundesland Schleswig-Holstein in particular struggled with an enormous rate of unemployment after the war. It was the Bundesland with the highest rate of unemployment in the western parts of Germany after the war. And it was also, and still is, a rather agrarian Bundesland, which meant that it mostly could offer work in the agrarian sector. The lack of housing was also a great problem. Historians have calculated that the war had destroyed about a fourth of the pre-war housing stock in Germany. And still in 1955, a decade after the war, some 370,000 people in Germany lived in camps. 3,000 camps spread out over the country. So the unemployment rate and the lack of housing were two German incitements to encourage emigration, and not least among women. That is important too, I think. Because of the war, it was a structural gap in the population in Germany after the war, with more women than men in working age. Because the National Labour Market Board in Sweden, AMS, by this point in time was responsible for both recruitment of foreign-born labor and the reception of quota refugees, the German initiative ended up at this authority. After that Gustav Möller had approved of the German initiative. After selection, mainly done by the German authorities, buses transferred about 800 young Germans to Sweden in 1950-1951. The German and the Swedish authorities agreed that the migrants should stay put in Sweden for at least 2 years. Otherwise, Swedish employers were not very interested in this campaign, in this project. These migrants were rather young. They were between 16 and 25 years old, but most of them were 19 or 20 or 21. A great majority of them were women. 600 out of this group of 800 were women. Many of these migrants also belonged to those more than 12 million Germans who had fled from or had been expelled from Central and Eastern Europe in connection with the end of the Second World War. About half of them belonged to the so-called Vertrieben or Heimatvertriebene. They were, in other words, refugees who were recruited to Sweden as labor migrants. That's a quite important point, I think. In cooperation between Swedish labor market authorities, West German authorities, and several different Swedish employers, most of these young Germans were, as I mentioned in the beginning, employed in Swedish garment and textile factories. About 100 of them ended up in match factories, mostly then in Jönköping, and some of the young boys ended up in the engineering industry, mainly in Atasea in Borås. The clothing factory Algots in Borås was the largest recipient in connection with this particular migration project. Algots received about 50 women out of this group of 800, but it also got permission from AMS to recruit another group of 40 German women from Schleswig-Holstein as well in 1951. And in 1956, it employed an additional 100 female workers from Germany or from Austria. So in total, Algots recruited 200 German-speaking women between 1950 and 1956. And that's the main reason I chose Algots for the local part of my study. For its time, Algots was also, as I mentioned, a very large garment plant with some 1,000 employed workers. And the management here introduced the conveyor belts early. In the Swedish perspective, it's early. It was in the early 1930s. But in retrospect, it's quite obvious that these migrants coming to Sweden within the Schleswig-Holstein campaign were allocated to workplaces where they could be fully productive workers after only a very short time of work training. At Algots, the management assigned German women to the sewing machines along the conveyor belts, pretty much as soon as they could handle the machines at least fairly well, often within a couple of days. So the reception of former refugees from Central and Eastern Europe with some humanitarian features were intercrossed with a more pragmatic labor recruitment, I would say, in a time period characterized by an unusual great demand for workers in Sweden. An important starting point for this study is the dynamics interplay between the three levels of the study, the international, national, and local level. The results of negotiations and encounters on one level were supposed to have repercussions on the other levels in a mutual interplay, from the top and down, as well as from the bottom and up, so to speak. I supposed when I started writing this book that the interplay between the international, national, and local market relations created the preconditions for the migrations. For instance, an agreement between the German and Swedish labor market authorities partly determined the circumstances for the relations between employer associations and national trade unions in Sweden as regards this particular migration. And what happened during the discussions on a national Swedish level between employer associations and trade unions determined the possibilities for individual employers, individual firms on local level to seek workers in Germany. For example, the possibilities of Algots management to recruit in Germany. But this also worked the other way around. If native-born workers perceived their encounters with foreign-born workers as a bit problematic on the shop floor, this often resulted in different kinds of complaints from the local trade union branches to the national trade union headquarters. And these local complaints were sometimes also combined with pleas for a decreased level of immigration, or at least combined with an argumentation for a regulation, more regulated migrations. I mentioned that I wrote my dissertation about World War refugees from Estonia and their encounters with Swedish car factory workers after the war. When Swedish employers recruited workers among the tens of thousands of refugees who had come to Sweden during the war, several Swedish local trade unions started to complain rather noisily, I would say. Especially trade unionists complained about Estonians. And they pointed out that these workers generally did not pay the trade union dues. And here, of course, very important to remember the very high degree of unionization in Sweden. In the metal engineering industry, it was over 95%. In comparison, if we compare that with the degree of unionization among the Estonians after a few years in Sweden, that was about 50%. Swedish workers also could complain that the migrants were not working in the right pace. The migrants were either accused of being slow helpers to skilled Swedish workers, thereby, so to speak, destroying their wages, or they could be very contradictory, accused of working too much and too fast, and not shutting down machines during breaks and so on, and thereby undercutting piece wages. Swedish-born workers accordingly could accuse the migrants of either working too fast or too slow. Both ways was the wrong way, so to speak. Some Swedish workers furthermore complained that employers gave migrants preferential treatment, saying that they gave them work assignments with extra preferential piece wages or priority on the housing market. Here it likewise important to remember that it was not only a shortage of workers in Sweden by this point in time, it was also a shortage of housing. Many Swedish employers therefore owned apartment buildings, bought new ones, built new ones during the post-war decade. where they accommodated workers, not least migrant workers. Algots, for instance, owned a lot of apartments in Borås where they accommodated migrant workers. This is one of the backgrounds to the preferential treatment argument. So these kinds of complaints arrived by correspondence to the National Trade Union headquarters in Stockholm about the low level of unionization, about the working pace, about the preferential treatment. And probably these complaints from the local level steered the national trade unions in a more restrictive direction, which then gave effect when the trade unions had opportunity to influence later of forthcoming migrations. The trade unions concerned on national level, in turn, often forwarded such complaints to the labor market authorities. And the Swedish National Labor Market Authority were founded, as you're probably aware of, as a social democratic institution. The top managers were social democrats, sometimes even old trade unionists, which meant that the ties between the trade union movement and the National Labor Market Board was really close or really tight. When the National Labor Market Board concluded international agreements as regards labor recruitment to Sweden, it certainly had the concerns of the Swedish trade unions in mind. For example, when Sweden signed its first bilateral agreements in 1947 about labor migration from Italy, from Hungary, and labor recruitments among the Sudeten German refugees in Austria, the Swedish National Labor Market Board made sure that the documents included an organization clause. Migrants who came to Sweden in accordance with these agreements were mandatory unionized already when they arrived in Sweden. So what happened on the shop floor level, I would say, affected these agreements made on the international level. Besides the fact that I found a very interesting source material during my research trip to Söderhamn, I mentioned to begin with, I developed my research questions for this project in relation to the actual composition of the foreign-born population in Sweden after the Second World War. This table here is in Swedish, but I guess you can understand the main message anyway. It shows how many foreign-born people resided in Sweden at different points in time, divided by nationality and gender. And as you can see in this table, the number of foreign-born people increased rather rapidly during the post-war decades. The number of refugees in Sweden during World War II reached a peak in the last winter of the war, 1944-1945, when about 180,000 or so foreign-born people resided in Sweden. By the end of 1945, some 100,000 foreign-born people were still in Sweden, but this number doubled during the first 5 post-war years, to 200,000 in 1950. In 1960, there were about 300,000 foreign-born people in Sweden, and in 1970, a bit more than 500,000. Still, what I mainly want to highlight with this table is the gendered structure of the immigrant population. During the whole period of post-war labor immigration to Sweden, that is basically the first 3 decades after the Second World War, there were more female migrants than male migrants in Sweden. As an example here, in 1960, I said it was 300,000 foreign-born people in Sweden, of whom 165,000 were women and 135,000 were men. And if these statistics are broken down into different nationalities, it's obvious that certain national groups were dominated by women and other groups were dominated by men. Female migrants, for instance, dominated the Finnish group in 1960. Of those 100,000 Finns in Sweden, 60% were women. Women dominate the Norwegian group, dominated German group. And these people were mainly, I would say, recruited to Sweden to work in garment industry, textile industries, or as domestic servants. The small Italian group and the Yugoslav group, which came to Sweden during the 1960s, basically, were on the other hand male-dominated. But it's also, I think, these male-dominated nationalities that have dominated the narratives of labor migration to Sweden during the post-war decades. I don't think at a table like this one is so interesting in its own, but it's helped me to ask research questions. Why are the German and the Finnish groups dominated by women, while men dominate the Italian and the Yugoslav group? Which actors have the power to influence migrations in this way? Or which are the structural reasons behind these gender differences? So in that way, it helped me ask questions. All Swedish companies that wanted to receive workers from the Schleswig-Holstein quota had to make an application to the Swedish National Labour Market Board. And these applications were a part of my source material. And they're often quite revealing, I think, as regards which kinds of workers the employers required, what particular skills they sought after when they demanded female or male workers. I've planned to show you two of these applications as two examples from my source material. The first example here is an application from Mölnlycke Väveri Aktiebolag, a textile company. This company told the Swedish authority that it wished to receive 20 female trainees between 18 and 25 years old. The company then, in this application, defined what kind of work these girls were supposed to perform and stressed which qualifications the women should have. If I translate from Swedish, the company emphasized that work was performed while standing up. I quote, "This means that the workers must have good legs and feet in addition to the general requirements, perfect eyesight and limber hands, especially fingers. Noticeable stoutness is a hindrance for work." End of quote. That hands and fingers should be limber were very often used as a motivation by the employers for female workers. They generally considered fine motor skills as a female capacity. But neither the Labour Market Board or the trade unions questioned this perception. My second example is an application from Aktiebolag Stockholms Strumpfabrik. This is rather revealing as well, I think, because it says a lot about the rate of labor turnover at this company. It reveals that the company wanted to replace Swedes with migrant workers. Swedes who left the workplace in search for better paid opportunities elsewhere, while migrant workers could not easily quit as easily as Swedes did. As said here, Stockholms Strumpfabrik wished to employ 15 young girls from Schleswig-Holstein. They should be about 16 years old and have good eyesight. A bit further down in this letter, it is a motivation. I quote again. "The assignments require a relatively long training time, at least 6 months. Girls over 25 can only exceptionally learn how to stitch." Then there's two words in Swedish I can't translate, kettla and avtosa. The supply of suitable Swedish girls is extremely limited. The demand for such workers is great, and those who start with us usually depart from the work because they don't have any problem finding other work which doesn't require such a long time of training. End of quote. So why women over 25, or men for that matter, could not learn these assignments is certainly not clear in this argumentation. But probably workers who had left the teenage years behind were probably not very interested in low-paid trainee work, especially not in a time when the demand for workers was by far overreached the supply. Better opportunities lured around the corner. For a young Swedish worker, it was rather easy to quit one job one day and find another one the next day. Migrant workers were a bit more restrained, at least non-Nordic migrants, as for example German migrants. because the work permits only approved work in a certain line of business. The work permit could, for instance, say seamstress, and it was not possible to quit that work and try to find work in the better paid metal and engineering industry, for instance. Newly arrived migrants were seldom parts of the social networks where information about other work opportunities circulated. It's also important to remember that employers in the better paid metal engineering industry were not allowed to publish notifications about job openings, job ads by this point in time, because the employer association did not want employers to recruit from each other by overbidding strategies. This meant that the social networks of the workers were even more important when searching for a new job. Migrant workers often also lived in company-owned housing, which limited their capabilities even more. A worker who quit his or her employment also lost his or her apartment. And again, because of the weaker social networks in the local area, migrant workers had generally fewer opportunities on the housing market than native-born Swedes. When a Swedish company had made an application to the National Labour Market Board, the authority referred the application to the trade union concerned. What the trade unions had to say in these referrals had great importance for the authority's forthcoming decision, if the trade union approved or denied the required recruitment. That more or less decided the outcome of the application process. The power of the trade unions were very great here. But my main point here is that the trade unions could use these applications from the employers and the influence with the social democratic dominated labor market authorities to put other work-related issues on the agenda in the relations with employers. The trade union national headquarters usually forwarded the referrals they received from National Labour Market Board to the local branches as well. So at both national and national level, trade unionists could use employers' demand for workers as a negotiation tool. To put it a bit simple, the trade unions could promise to approve labor recruitments abroad if the company managements, for instance, agree to improve working conditions in the factory, or if they increase the payments offered for piecework for certain assignments. Mainly, I should say, the Metal Workers Union used such applications in this way. As regard the Garment Workers Union, it was more common that the trade union connected the labor immigration with the general problem of unionizing all workers at all the workplaces. Less garment workers were unionized than metal engineering workers by this point in time. I've planned to show you two of these examples as well, both examples from Borås and the Garment Workers Union. The first one here is a letter from the National Trade Union headquarters in Stockholm to the local branch in Borås. Firma Nilsson Konfektion, just outside Borås, had already applied for approval of recruiting 8 German seamstresses, but the leadership of the Garment Workers Union was highly doubtful in this case. Mostly the trade unionists were negatively inclined because the workers in this factory were not unionized. Nevertheless, the trade unionists speculate in this letter, if the German women were mandatory unionized already when they came to Sweden, the trade union would get a foothold at this workplace. In that case, it might be a reason to approve their recruitment. But this was a bit of an exception. The trade unions almost always rejected applications when they came from employers whose workplaces were not unionized. My second example concerns Algots. In October 1951, the management of Algots required another 100 foreigners, as the trade union representative wrote here. Also in this case, the trade unions tried to use the migrations as a tactical weapon. It's quite obvious when I read this letter that the trade union planned from the start to reject this application. I quote in English as from the third sentence. However, we question if it's wise to give a direct direction. We would like to see this application in connection with a forthcoming negotiation of some sort about mandatory union affiliation for all formal workers. A direct disapproval before these negotiations would therefore perhaps not be appropriate. In essence, the trade union accordingly indicated that if the company made sure that all foreign-born workers already employed at this company were unionized, the union might consider approving a new recruitment. As I mentioned, in this context, with the great demand for workers, it was rather easy to quit one employment and directly find another one. Many workers who were not satisfied with the work situation searched for new and hopefully better employments. During the 1950s and 1960s, the rate of labor turnover could reach very high levels more than 50% at several Swedish industrial corporations. I mentioned, for instance, Stockholm Strumpfabrik earlier. I think that this aspect is very important if we want to understand post-war labor migration to Sweden, that industrial work were in the middle of process of change, and that is an important background to the migrations. In a Swedish perspective, as I also mentioned, Algots was very early when it organized work along conveyor belts already in the 1930s. Before the conveyor belts were introduced at Algots, the workers sat side by side around a table sewing, as in this blurred picture here from the 1920s. When work process was organized this way, it had a social dimension. It was possible to talk a bit with your fellow workmates while working. I should also say that the economic historian Ulla Vikander has also written a bit about this. I think I have borrowed this picture actually from one of her articles. But this social dimension of work disappeared with the conveyor belts. Instead of sitting next to each other, the management put the workstations and the sewing machines in long lines, as in this second picture here from the 1930s. The seamstresses could from now on only see the closest fellow workmate in the neck, so to speak. No more small talk during work. All work assignments at Algots were gendered, even though the gender dynamics changed over time. And also what's important here is also that in the early 1950s, the management had divided the work processes into very short tempos. The pace of the conveyor belts were also possible to change, and step by step, the pace increased. When we are in the early 1950s, every single assignment along these conveyor belts was supposed to take about 20 seconds to perform before the seamstress put down the garment, put up a new one, and performed exactly the same assignment once more for 20 seconds, then again, week after week, perhaps even month after month. Work became boring and stressful. During the 1930s, all employed seamstresses along the conveyor belts were women. And when all the workers were women, even most of the supervisors were also women actually. But this changed during the late 1940s when Algots started to employ workers among the World War refugees, mainly Estonians. Then the management started to recruit also male workers. And when some of the workers along the conveyor belts were men, all newly appointed supervisors were also men. This seems to be rather common that the gender division of work can change in connection with migration processes. Not least that men are recruited to do work which has previously been considered to be women's work. At the same time, it was some other important rotations at the workplace. The management reassigned all women who was working at a relatively well-paid press department to the conveyor belts after the Second World War, and from now on only recruited men to the press department, as is shown here in one of the pictures. Overall, there were more men than women working at Algots than I had expected when I started this research project. So I got a bit surprised actually when I started to count. This is my last PowerPoint picture. In 1950, for instance, Algots had a bit over 800 employed workers, of whom 500 were women, but at least 300 were actually men. But what I mainly want to show with this picture is that the working conditions along the conveyor belts created a remarkable rate of labor turnover. Those who had the opportunity to find other jobs seemingly tried to do that. The greatest problem for Algots during the 1950s was not to recruit the required number of workers, but actually to keep those who were recruited. During this 10-year period, Algots employed more than 12,000 workers. After Swedes, Finns were the greatest group. Algots employed several thousands of Finns during the 1950s. Even so, the management constantly complained that they did not have enough workers to use all the machines as it wanted to. Between 1952 and 1954, for instance, Algots managed to increase its workforce by 300 people. It wanted to increase the workforce, but to do this, it was necessary to employ almost 4,000 workers in 1953 and 1954. Between 1950 and 1957, the average annual rate of labor turnover was 114%. So more than the whole workforce was thus exchanged every year. To some degree, but only to some degree, these high numbers had to do with the seasons of agricultural work. It was still rather common after the Second World War that young workers from agrarian homes left their industrial employments in the beginning of the summer, went home and helped the parents with the farm, and usually they came back to the industry again in the fall. Many Finnish workers also went back to Finland over the summer. They returned as well after a few months in many cases. So that means that these 12,000 employments are not individual workers. Several of these workers quit, come back several times. But only to a certain degree, this is seasonal. So my final point here is that, seen from this perspective, the 200 German-speaking women that Algots recruited in the first half of the 1950s only made up a very small minority of all those workers it employed. But I think that these numbers partly explain why the management was so interested in Germans, whom at least were more or less obliged to stay put for at least 2 years. Algots required chiefly young and unmarried women for the work assignments along conveyor belts, and such workers were available in Schleswig-Holstein. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johan, for an interesting presentation. I was just to check if there's any questions. You can use your raise hand function. And I will see this. Otherwise, I was interested in this. Your slide on the gender, foreign-born people
population
living in
Sweden.
Yeah, divided by gender. I don't know why I thought this, but I thought that it would be more male. For all the industries, male migrants living in Sweden for this period. I don't know why. It's not like I'm not an historian of migration, so I haven't really studied this, but it's more of a like general knowledge. But so, were you surprised when you found this?
Yeah, a bit. I would say the grand narrative I would say about labor migration to Sweden is often about the Italians, the small Italian group or the Yugoslav group, which are in fact male dominated. But it's often forgotten that the Finnish group is had a majority of women. And the thing is that's important too, that during the first post-war decade, a majority of all migrants who came to Sweden were women. And after 1955 and onwards, there were more men than women that came to Sweden. But it was not so many more that it changed the composition, actually. The composition of those living in Sweden were still a majority women. That, of course, also had to do with the rate of return migration. I have no numbers on that, but it seems like, at least, I've not seen any numbers on this, but it seems like the return migration were high among men than among women. That also adds to this picture.
Very, very interesting. I definitely need to read about more on this. Okay, any questions from the audience? Otherwise, I will say thank you, Johan, for this presentation. And if you came in late or you want to, you have someone you think would be interested in this, we will publish the speak on our YouTube channel, at the Arab YouTube channel. So thank you very much, and see you in a month for the next talk. Bye.